What's up, everybody? I'm Jason. Welcome back to the podcast. So we're getting to that time where it's pretty obvious that the Canon is going to be releasing the EOS R5 in, the nearish future. The next probably 6 months, we'll see its announcement. That'll give it. That'll be 4 years. The Canon 5 series have consistently been updated on 4-year increments or 4-year intervals for basically as long as Canon has had the 5 series. So why everybody thought they were going to release an R5 Mark II 2 years ago is beyond me. But 2024 is going to be 4 years on the R5, and we should probably expect to see one. Which means, of course, that everybody's doing their thing, talking about what they want in the camera and what they'd like to see. And, of course, needless to say, Canon doesn't care. They're not listening to any of us. Certainly they're not going to listen to me, but they're definitely not listening to anybody talking about this on YouTube. Yeah. So why am I talking about it? Well, partly because I wanted to see how crazy I was. Obviously, if the only thing only person you're talking to is yourself about things that you'd like to see in the camera, then you've got a really tiny echo chamber to bounce your ideas off of. And partly, I wanted to just throw some stuff out there that maybe people would find interesting to have in a camera. And of course, like I said, Canon doesn't listen to us directly, but if we all leave Canon feedback about the product, or we all communicate to Canon through Canon's channels and CPS and so on and so forth, eventually they get the message. When enough of us say, hey, this isn't good, or this needs to be fixed, eventually the message does make it back to Canon. So I was originally going to call this 10 things I'd like to see on the EOS R5. Actually, I was originally going to call this an argument for a 60 megapixel R5 Mark II, and even it sucks. But I don't have 10 things, and while I do have an argument for a 60 megapixel R5 Mark II, it even the best argument I can come up with really does suck. So the rumor mill has been talking pretty consistently now about the R5 Mark II being a 60 megapixel camera. And it doesn't take an awful lot of listening to this podcast so far to get the idea that I am absolutely not in favor of this. I don't want a 60 megapixel camera. I don't think more resolution is the right solution right now. Certainly Nikon hasn't increased the resolution on their cameras since the D850, and that was released in 2015 or something like that, around 2015. And they're still topping out at 45 megapixels. Sony, even the A7R Mark IV and A7R5, both are 60 megapixel cameras. Sony certainly could have upped the resolution in the A7R Mark V, and they didn't. Canon, of course, is sitting in this, I guess you could call it, limbo area where, the R5 is a 45 megapixel camera. They could certainly go to 60 and match Sony, or they could stay at 45. Like I said, personally, I would rather stay at 45 and have a better sensor come out of it, have better pixels at 45 megapixels, so to speak, or a better sensor overall at 45 megapixels, than have more resolution at marginally better performance, or more resolution at the same performance. For me, the problem with resolution comes down to, there's many problems that I have with more resolution. It's more demanding on lenses. Now, that's not to say that Canon isn't building their RF lenses, or at least their L-series RF lenses, to support 60 megapixel and beyond resolutions, but if you're not using L-series RF lenses, you're going to have less. The images aren't going to match, or the lenses potentially aren't going to resolve what your sensor is capable of. And given the way we work with pixels or pictures at a pixel level, so we're not working with images at sub-diffraction, imaging type resolutions, where there's a 250 megapixel sensor that's giving us a 50 or 40 megapixel, 45 or 50 megapixel image. And by having that really high sensor, the actual process works kind of more like film, where the individual pixels on the sensor aren't relevant anymore. It's how the camera gets that down into a usable image format that it outputs. We're not there. We don't work with images that way. Even if you go into Lightroom and Photoshop, they're all still entirely pixel-centric. And of course, I know somebody's going to say, well, but it'll always be... Yeah, images are always going to be made up fundamentally on pixels. But what I'm talking about images being pixel-centric, I'm meaning things like sharpening in Lightroom is defined as a pixel radius as opposed to a radius or an area on the sensor. So pixel agnostic as opposed to pixel oriented. So it demands more from our lenses. Part of the problem with that, of course, is that it makes the lenses more expensive. So yeah, everything's getting more expensive, but the higher the resolution sensor, given the same way or the way that we work with images is in photography and videography, so as things stand, the lenses have to be able to resolve those sensor resolutions, and so long as that is, you could say, the driving factor, the driving case, then you have this problem of needing better lenses or needing to design lenses to be much better, and therefore making the lenses more expensive. It's more demanding of technique. So as a photographer, I have to be better at the technical bits. It's not just, and I'm not talking about exposure, I'm talking like how you hold your camera and how good of a tripod you're using, what the stability of the ground you're on is. I mean, we're at in a position where with sufficient lens magnification, so sufficient zoom, and sufficient in-camera resolution settings, you can get super tight pictures, but you can actually see when somebody walks within 10 feet of the camera. Unless you're sitting literally on solid granite bedrock, the camera vibrates enough that if somebody walks within 10 feet of the camera, you can see the image shake. That never used to be a consideration with lower resolution sensors. So it's not just it was, but you really needed some ridiculous glass, like better than a 1200 millimeter lens. So it's not just a case of, we need better glass that's more expensive, which means even if you're not talking about, buying the better glass right away, the engineers have to target these higher resolutions in designing the lenses that are going to come out next year and the year after and so on and so forth, which is going to consistently increase the price of glass. We need better technique. Some of that is we can work around, some of that is addressable. A lot of that is just straight up, you have to be better. And it's not so much a matter of just focusing on the picture or just turning on image stabilization. It's you just have to get good. The demands on stuff like image stabilization increase. So we can... Image stabilization is always a tricky thing because the way it's calculated or rated by the Camera Imaging Product Association, CIPA, is not necessarily reflective of how it actually is going to perform. But the more demanding we make the sensors, if you still want pixel sharp images, which again goes back to the how we work with pictures, you need better image stabilization, or you lose the rated, you have to derate what they're rating the image stabilizer at. Files get bigger. Okay, that's not a huge problem, although it seems like it's a big enough problem that the rumor mill is talking about some kind of smaller RAW format that's not CRAW, but it's not full whatever 45 or 60 megapixel resolution. We've been there. Canon used to do that on their cameras in the past. They got rid of it with CRAW. It never was really raw in the same way that Canon's normal RAW and or their lossy compressed RAW are raw. It was a weird format that I don't know if that's where we want to go back with all of this. So like I said, not a fan of going down the road of more resolution. But I have one argument that goes for increasing the resolution on the camera, and that's electronic breathing correction. So electronic breathing correction was a feature that was introduced with the EOS R6 Mark II, and fundamentally it works by cropping and magnifying the image to compensate for breathing, or at least cropping the image to compensate for breathing. It's a video thing. And it exploits, in the case of the R5 Mark II, or the R6 Mark II, it exploits the fact that the camera can only output 4K but has a 6K sensor. So there's 50% more resolution available for the camera to work with. And the R6 Mark II, as I understand it, downsamples from 6K to 4K. So you can deal with breathing simply by changing the size of the window area on the sensor that the camera is actually using, and continuing to downsample from that to 4K, and you still get good looking downsampled 4K, but you also have the ability to deal with the fact that the camera or the lens breathes and the angle of view changes. My guess is that this whole process exploits the same underlying processing software, etc., as digital IS does, as well as basically the image processing capabilities that already exist in the camera, which raises some questions about why it couldn't be implemented on, for example, the R3, or implemented in some extent on the R5, the original R5, or really any other Canon camera, simply on the grounds that if the camera can already crop and reposition or move a window arbitrarily on the sensor, and move a window likely arbitrarily in size on the sensor, that's what digital image stabilization does, then it should be able to dynamically resize a window based on the focal length information that the lens is feeding back to the camera. So the breathing problem with still lenses comes down to basically this. If you're not familiar with breathing because you don't do video, or you're not, don't really focus on video, it's essentially, it is the change in focal length that happens when you change the focus position of the lens. So we're not talking about zooming, we're talking about going from infinity focus to close focus, and how that affects the angle of view that the lens renders. So for example, if you have an RF 15 to 35 f2.8L IS USM, and you have it set to 35 millimeters, at minimum focus distance, the angle of view is 9% wider than it is at infinity. So it changes. Now, of course, one of the tenets of this whole problem is you can't uncrop an image. You can't uncrop the sensor. So if the image area, due to the wider angle of view, falls outside of the sensor area, you can't recover that. So the only thing you can do to deal with breathing is crop at a narrower, or crop a wider or narrower field of view, or wider field of view image. Now I'm getting all messed up in the thought process on this. Crop the wider field of view image to a narrower field of view that matches what it does at, say, infinity, or at any other focal point. So basically, at infinity, you have the lens uncropped because that's the narrowest angle of view that the camera deals with. And then as you focus the lens closer and the angle of view gets wider, the camera crops in on that to ensure that the actual angle of view that you're looking at stays the same. Now, that whole process entails a certain compromise when it comes to talking about maintaining image quality. So if you're downsampling, and this would be true too if you're line skipping, but in a downsampling situation, and quite honestly, I don't really think Canon is going to have anything but downsampling in future high-end mirrorless cameras. It's the demanded solution from the video side of things, so it seems like it's going to be a reasonable assumption that in order to compete with Nikon Z9 and Z8 and whatever Sony's coming out with or doing, that Canon would want to make the image down, cameras downsample. But if you're downsampling or anything, either way, your sensor resolution has to be greater than your output resolution. So we could say the best case or the worst case scenario is that the downsampling scaling factor is 1, meaning your sensor reads out at the same resolution that you output to your file, then that's still going to be acceptable. But as soon as you start cropping, you can't support that higher that equal resolution. So in the case of a camera like, for example, the R5, you have an 8K sensor, and as soon as you have to start cropping in, you're now upsampling to write an 8K file instead of downsampling to write or not down, like 1-to-1 downsampling or just straight copying to create that 8K file. So the consequence of this with digital breathing correction is, of course, that the sensor resolution now has to be greater than the maximum output resolution that you're allowing the camera to shoot at times the maximum crop factor correction that you need for the breathing operation. So when the camera is cropping in on that now wider angle image at minimum focus distance, that needs to crop into at least the supported output resolution or higher. And of course, on the R6 Mark II, this works fine. A 6K sensor has 6,000 pixels horizontal active. That's what the camera has. It's a 16.9 active image area, so the actual sensor is 6,000 by 3375 pixels, or roughly that, which is then downsampled to a 4K UHD resolution, so 3840 by 2160. And basically, we have more than 50% of extra pixels on that camera. So we have a lot of room to deal with lenses that breathe without compromising the downsampled video quality or the video quality as a whole. So if there's, if the lens is breathing free, it's perfectly corrected, then you get 6,000 pixels downsampled to 3840. If the lens only has 10% breathing, then it's 5,400 pixels that get downsampled. It would have to crop in the worst case scenario. So that would be like minimum focus distance. More than likely, you're going to be working at some position in between, in which case the camera isn't going to have to crop as much, but we're talking sort of worst cases. Worst case, if the lens has a 30% amount, or breathes by 30%, then you need the sensor would be read out at about 4,200 pixels, which is still way more than 3840 by 2160 horizontal resolution, at least. Way more, 4,200 is still way more than 3,840. So you're still downsampling, you still get good image quality. So how does this play out on a 60 megapixel EOS R5 Mark II? Well, 60 megapixels, if you do the math, works out to a sensor that's about 9,487 pixels wide. I know that's kind of specific, but I worked for exactly 60 megapixels in a 3:2 aspect ratio. Now, of course, Canon could obviously design the sensor, but it's going to be in that like almost 9,500 pixel wide area. So for DCI 8K, which is 8,192 pixels wide, you need at least 8,192 pixels. And you can do that with a lens that breathes at most 15%. So it's wider, 15% wider at its widest position or widest focus position compared to its narrow, infinity or narrowest focus position. And for UHD, so the 16:9 aspect ratio, that goes up to about 23%. So that's reasonable. But is it good enough? which raises the question about, well, what lenses do you like? How do you target this? So you're going to do digital breathing correction, and it needs to, can you, from the design perspective, so put yourself in the position of, Canon's designers. Do you make it work, for example, like the multi-exposure mode does now, where it'll work with some lenses, it doesn't work with other lenses, and you're SOL if your lens you happen to like or use a lens that it doesn't work with. So like a 14 to 35 f4 has too much distortion for the camera to support it in the current R5 for the camera to support it in multi-exposure mode. So it won't let you use that lens. So do you accept that as a process going forward? And say lenses that just breathe too much, we're not going to accept. Well, I guess you could, but I'm not sure how well that actually plays out. So I was curious to see how all of the breathing situation played out and how much you actually needed. Now, I don't have every lens Canon has made or Canon makes. I have a couple of I have several good RFL lenses. These are the ones I was most interested in testing it on. I threw them all through a gauntlet. So if you saw my last podcast where I was talking about writing software to do breathing detection or breathing measurements, this is what I was writing it for. So I threw the lenses through this software. I tested my 28 to 70 f2. I tested my 24 to 70 f2.8, and my 15 to 35 f2.8. I didn't bother testing my 100 to 500 because I didn't think it was really specifically the kind of lens that I would be using in this situation. And while it may breathe, like I said, it just didn't seem like worth testing. However, out of these, the 28 to 70 by far breathes the most of any of these lenses. 26% wider at its shortest focus distance compared to infinity. And if you do the math on that, that means that you would need a 10,322 pixel wide sensor instead of a 9,487 pixel wide 60 megapixel sensor. So to compensate for the breathing for that lens, you would need a 71 megapixel sensor to make it work. And that's why this is kind of a crap argument. 60 megapixels is more, but it's not enough to do digital breathing correction potentially for every Canon RF lens. And the lens that it's missing in this case isn't a lens that I could potentially say, well, you don't have to worry about it because, this is a entry-level lens and, we're talking about a $4,000 professional camera and, maybe it is acceptable for the $4,000 professional camera to not fully correct or correct a $400 entry-level lens, but this is an almost $3,000 currently professional lens. It's easily the most expensive non-super telephoto prime and easily the most expensive, basically non-super telephoto lens Canon has ever made. That's kind of a big deal to, we're gonna do electronic breathing correction, but the one really good lens that we make, the general purpose zoom, we're not gonna support. And of course, there could be other L lenses that I haven't tested that breathe more than the 28 to 70. And again, I'm not saying the 28 to 70 is a bad lens because of this. It's a great still lens. It's still a reasonable video lens if you don't need to do focus pulls. It just becomes problematic when you get into that focus pull regime where the breathing becomes an issue. Now, of course, the other thing you could say is, well, just don't support the breathing correction in 8K. Do it in 4K, which might be entirely reasonable. Certainly, even now with the R5, we could easily have that implemented if Canon wanted to do that. The 8K sensor area downsampling to 4K, there's 100% extra resolution. It's more resolution available there than there is in the R6 Mark II's 6K downsampling to 4K. So they could easily probably implement it. And like I said, I think this is already, it basically is building on like what digital image stabilization does in video mode, where it just crops in and moves the window around based on camera movement. So in theory, Canon could very easily have already patched electronic breathing correction into cameras like the R5 and the R3, simply as a firmware update, exploiting the camera's capabilities. Bear in mind, the R6 Mark II doesn't use a new processor. It's using the same Digic X processor that the R5 and R3 use. That, and just limit it to 4K. So it works for 4K, it works for 2K or 1080p. It doesn't work in 8K and in RAW, obviously. So, not a big deal. Or at least to me, I see it that way. You have the choice, if you're, going to do serious filmmaking, you have the choice of turning on the electronic breathing correction and having the camera, deal with that versus having the camera, having 8K, where potentially you have to deal with it in post with cropping and so on and so forth. The only real issue that I see out of this whole thing ultimately comes down to sensor read performance, how fast they can get the data out of the sensor. And actually, to me, the problem isn't so much sensor read performance, because quite clearly we can read large sensors very quickly. Blackmagic Design, who's not Canon by any stretch of the imagination, did the had a 12K cinema camera with an 80 megapixel wide aspect ratio sensor, and it worked fine. I'm not going to say it had, I've never tested one, so I can't speak specifically to, say, rolling shutter performance, but it certainly was able to read out the sensor fast enough to do video. That's not, I don't think is really the problem. I think ultimately the problem really ends up being in a camera like the R5 or R5 Mark II, heat being one of them, except on the sensor side of things, the sensor isn't being read out any more inducingly, like it's not being, there's no greater demand on it than there is currently. In fact, there might even be less, since you're cropping and therefore you're not, or you're, windowing on the sensor, so you're not reading out all the pixels all the time. I think the real problem ends up potentially being on the memory bandwidth, because everything kind of has to roll through memory at some point as it's getting written out to, or compressed and written out to the card. And the question is there enough bandwidth to support, doing that processing and getting it out to the card? Now, again, I think there is, because digital image stabilization works. And digital image stabilization on the R5 currently isn't really doing anything any different than what the electronic breathing correction needs. So that's my one argument for a higher resolution R5 Mark II, that I still don't think is a very good argument for a higher resolution R5 Mark II. Personally, I'd like to see Canon stick at 45 megapixels. If they're really wanting to push a little more, maybe go to 50, but going up another 15 megapixels to 60 doesn't feel like it's going to have the diminishing returns, is what I'm getting at, are just kicking in like crazy at this point. And it gives you a big number to put on the box, but it doesn't really do anywhere near what I think some photographers think it's going to do for them, and it certainly doesn't do anywhere near what the big number on the box might try to imply that it's going to do. So with that said, I want to talk about some things I'd like to see in the R5 Mark II. And the first part of this really comes down to, I would really like to see Canon renew focus on RAW. You can make an argument that as long as the camera has RAW, you don't need all the bells and whistles and whiz-bang features and so on and so forth. But But what we've been seeing over the course of the evolution of the EOS R platform is very much, for better or worse, a diminishing, at least it feels this way to me, focus on RAW or delivering RAW related features. So first of all, I'd like to see Canon add a RAW histogram. They would be the first camera company, as far as I know, maybe Hasselblad or Phase 1 do this, but they would be the first camera company to have a RAW histogram mode. Now, I know there are people out there that use Unity white balance or Uni white balance or whatever it's called, and they set up the things so that the white balance gives them like raw reflects the raw gains and whatnot. And that's fine if that's your cup of tea. I mean, by all means. But I have a real problem with screwing up the white balance and screwing up the viewfinder color just to get a histogram that's accurate or accurately reflects raw levels. That to me is not a solution. And it's not a solution to flick into custom one picture style mode or whatever, or white balance mode to get this to come up and then switch back to the normal picture style or white balance modes that you're using or auto or whatever. It just not really, like, we shouldn't have to do this as photographers. Canon can very easily give us a histogram of the raw data coming off of the sensor. And there's no reason that the histogram setting for the live histogram and the review histogram can't be brightness, RGB, raw. That's it. Easy. And the raw one just gives you the raw histogram. So that's one I'd like to see. Number two, I would like to see Canon upgrade that multi-shot super resolution mode that they added in firmware, what was it, 1.7, 1.8 for the R5, to give us unprocessed raw outputs. Do the pixel shift, shoot the images, let us just keep the raws. Sony does this. It's the only way you can do the high-resolution multi-shot on Sony. Olympus does this as well, as far as I understand. There is no reason that we need to have a camera a $4,000 professional high-resolution camera that stitches images together and saves a JPEG like you would in an R50. Your basic entry-level consumer type camera. We should be able to get our multi-shot images shot and saved in RAW. And of course, the biggest frustration, and I've talked about this over and over when talking about super resolution mode, to me is unless you remember to shoot, like even if you want to use it, unless you remember to shoot a non-super resolution RAW of the scene, if your image ends up with the artifacts from anything moving, then that image is ruined and you do not have a backup. Like, at least if you're doing RAW that is post-processed in either DPP or Photoshop or wherever you want to post-process it into your super resolution image, at least if that super resolution image doesn't come out, you can take one of the RAWs and use that. So yeah, maybe you don't end up with a 400 megapixel source image for your print. You end up with a 45 megapixel source image, which is still going to make a really good print. 3, I can't say for certain, but in the direction that Canon has gone in the R3, the R6 Mark II, and all of the newer cameras, essentially everything since the EOS R5 and R6, multi-exposure mode has gone away or is no longer done in RAW, it's done in JPEG. Again, this is part of that emphasis. I would like to see Canon renew their interest or emphasis on RAW and high-quality imaging. The multi-exposure mode is, I understand the limitation. It has to do with those lens corrections again, and it has to do with the fact that you can't apply those lens corrections to RAW files. You can only really apply them when you're pixel manipulating a JPEG. And if you have lenses that don't give you the, aren't distortion corrected enough to produce a good image, then you could run into problems when you're doing multiple exposures. And multiple exposure mode is a general tool. It is designed to allow you to do a number of things creatively. However, the one thing that I've always used it for is to do essentially synthetic or computational neutral density. So we're talking about the process of averaging, essentially. Shoot a bunch of images and average them. If you shoot 8 images, that is the equivalent of 3 stops of neutral density. If you shoot 4 images, that's 2 stops. If you average 2 images, that's 1 stop. If you're not going to give, and I don't expect them to support multi-exposure mode in RAW on the R5 Mark II, I expect it to go to JPEG like everything else it has on every other Canon camera. Then at least, can we please have an actual RAW-driven synthetic computational neutral density system? Like, I should be able to put my camera into, or turn on synthetic neutral density. You don't have to assume that the image is going to zoom or the focus is going to change. In fact, you could lock the focus, turn off the autofocus system between frames. All kinds of optimizations that could certainly be made to make this work really nicely. But give me the ability to say, I want the camera to simulate 5 stops of neutral density. So it's going to shoot 2 to the 5th images and average them together and write that out to the card as a single file. Not a big deal. In fact, I would also like an intelligent user interface behind this so that I could not only do that, but I could also just say, I want a 2-minute exposure. A 2-minute exposure, not a long exposure for 2 minutes. I want you to take the current, whatever your exposure is, and repeat an average for 2 minutes so that instead of having to do the whole typical neutral density dance, you want 6 stops of neutral density to get a 2-minute exposure from sunset. So you have to meter the scene and look and say, okay, well, the exposure is this. So I need 5 stops, or I need to, wait so long or whatever. I want to just be able to say, give me a 2-minute exposure. Since we're just averaging, you just shoot, however many 32nd or 30th of a second or whatever it is exposures, add them together, divide it by the total number of exposures that you have, and you have the average of this whole process. And of course, the other huge advantage of going through this synthetic computational neutral density regime is better images. Anytime you average, anybody who does astrophotography knows this. Nobody who shoots an astrophotography points their camera at a nebula or a star cluster and says, I need a 2-hour exposure, so I'm going to just make 1 2-hour long exposure. They will make hundreds of 30-second exposures or 15-second exposures or whatever the longest reasonable exposure they have, because they know, as is the case, that whenever you average, align, stack, and average image information like this, noise is reduced, dynamic range is increased, and you get a better image out of the end result of this whole process compared to what you would have if you just did 1 long exposure. So even barring all of this, the fact that okay, I don't want to have to carry neutral density. I kind of have to carry it for video, but like for stills, I would rather not have to carry really expensive glass filters that are prone to being dropped and broken. But on top of that, if I'm shooting a 2 to 5 minute exposure with a 6 to 10 stop neutral density filter in front of my lens versus shooting that as a sequence of, short exposures that are being averaged together, the short exposures averaged together are going to give me a better picture. There's going to be more dynamic range. There's going to be less noise. The image is going to look better. And, I don't have to worry about like motion blur or something moving. I mean, that's the whole point of why I'm shooting this 2-minute long exposure with neutral density, is that I want to drag things out. I want clouds to become smears. I want the water to become a fog as opposed to individual ripples, all of that kind of thing. So let me do it in the camera. I'd like some UI improvements. These shouldn't be hard. In fact, they should be doable in like 30 seconds, even on current cameras. For starters, on the top LCD, which I'm still not entirely convinced is all that relevant anymore, given that it doesn't display any more than the current shutter or the current exposure mode when the camera's off. And when it's on, all of the information that the top LCD displays is also on the rear LCD in EVF 90% of the time. But if you're going to keep it, I would like a black text on a white background top mode for the top display. So basically what happens when you turn the backlight on, I'd like to be able to have that all the time without the backlight on. Personally, I find it very difficult in a lot of lighting conditions to read the white text on black. There's just not enough contrast, or there's just not enough light in the text to make up for low light. And I'm not talking terribly low light. I run into this a lot in just regularly lit interiors. So a more contrastier, a mode that has more light reflecting back from the transflective LCD with less black would be nice to have. I'd also, on the UI niceties point, like to have a customizable quick control menu. There's stuff in there that I certainly don't begrudge people who use from having, like flicker reduction or auto light optimizer, or being able to change the metering modes or the image quality or the picture styles. If that's something you use, you absolutely should have easy access to it. It's not stuff I change that much. It's not something I change enough that I need or want super fast access to it. Like changing image quality, if I do it maybe once a month, if that. So why do I need it prominently in the fast access menu that's the quick control menu? Give me the ability to put things there that I actually use. Even if they're things that seem trivially inconsequential, like turning on the viewfinder grid. If it's something I do a lot, it should be something I can get to easily without having to dig through the camera menus or give up a button that is potentially much more important for other camera operations that I do a real lot, like anytime I'm taking a picture. Customization is something that's always better for us as users because it gets us to have our cameras in a setup that is optimal for us to use. And what's optimal for me, I guarantee, is not going to be optimal for everybody watching this video. And what's optimal for any person watching this video is probably not going to be optimal for me. And that's the whole point of customization. I don't have to try to pound a square peg in a round hole. I can make the hole in the peg match. Speaking of UI niceties, this is also another minor one, but something that I have talked about in the past, a better distance scale. Okay, congratulations, Canon. You didn't mess this up nearly as bad as the completely brain-dead distance scale that Nikon has on their cameras, or at least had on their cameras prior to firmware version 4 for the Z9, where you had a little flower indicating macro on one side and a little infinity symbol indicating that it was infinity on the other, and a bar in between, and absolutely zero numbers whatsoever across the entire screen of the camera. So yes, you could see that you were moving the lens towards macro, but you had no idea where it actually was focused. That is not good design. Canon's is only marginally better. It gives us feet, but in a lot of lenses and with a lot of cases, this indication, or meters, I should say, it gives us distance indications. But in a lot of cases with a lot of lenses, the distance indications are, well, hey, there is a lot of places that I can focus my lens between 10 feet and infinity that doesn't have 10 feet or infinity in focus. This is especially true with telephoto lenses, even stuff like 50 to 70 millimeters, and especially with fast lenses in 50 to 70 millimeters. Not having a number is not ideal. And in fact, this whole business of skeuomorphic design distance scales on mirrorless cameras is just kind of crap. Like, it made sense on manual focus lenses. You had to paint something on the lens barrel. You couldn't do things dynamically with it. But that's not the case anymore. We don't have anything painted on our lens barrels that have anything to do with distance at all, or depth of field or anything like that. And the cameras have more than enough computational power to take the distance information that the lens is feeding into it and do math with it. All we really need as photographers are 3 numbers. Distance scale literally could be 3 numbers. The distance to the near depth of far field limit, the distance the camera lens is focused at, and the distance of the far depth of field limit. And having those 3 numbers gives us the ability to do all of the things that you used to be able to do with a manual focus lens pretty easily, just the same. So you want to focus at the hyperfocal distance? Easy. Set the distance, select the aperture you want to shoot at, set the focus or focus the lens until the far depth of field limit says infinity. At that point, you're at the hyperfocal distance. You want to focus 15 feet in front of the camera and make sure you have enough depth of field for 7 feet. Focus the camera until the focus distance, which in my mind would be like the middle number, says 15 feet. Then adjust the aperture until the far and near limits are 7 feet either side of that, or 3.5 feet either side of that if you want 7 feet total. Not really that difficult to implement, especially with the camera gets aperture information from the lens, it gets focus distance information from the lens, it gets focal length information, all the stuff you need to calculate depth of field is right there. It would not be difficult to implement. Continuing on this whole thing of sort of focus, stopped down focusing. All Canon cameras already do this. When you're shooting video, the camera doesn't open the aperture, refocus, and then stop the aperture back down. Whatever aperture you put the camera in, it focuses. It stays at that aperture. So it's not like the camera can't do this. But for whatever reason, when you shoot photos, the camera always focuses maximum or widest aperture, then stops down to take the picture. Sony and Nikon both have adopted the idea of doing stopped down focusing. Sony gives you an option. Do you want to focus with the aperture wide open and then stop down and shoot, or do you want to keep the aperture stopped down and focus and shoot from there? Nikon doesn't give you the option. They just force it. If you have a lens or you're shooting at an aperture that's f5.6 and faster, the camera just focuses at the aperture that you've selected. So if you've got a 50mm f1.2 on your Nikon Z9 or Z6 Mark II for that matter, and you're shooting at f2.8, the camera doesn't focus at f1.2 and then stop down to 2.8. It focuses at 2.8. The only case where this doesn't really hold is if the lens and teleconverter that you're using is slower than f5.6. So you have a lens and teleconverter combination that's f8, in which case the lens focuses at f8. And if you were shooting at f11, either way, the lens will focus at either f5.6, or if it does the lens and teleconverter is, say, f8, and it'll focus at f8, then it'll stop down to f11 and shoot. Personally, I find that whole thing complicated. If you couldn't follow where I was going or what I was talking about with that discussion, that's kind of why I think it's complicated. 2 modes. Focus wide open, focus stop down. That's all we really need. Basically what Sony has. Focus wide open, the camera just focuses at the maximum aperture and then stops down to wherever you're shooting. Focus stop down, the camera does what it does in video mode. It focuses where it is stopped down. Also, shooting or focusing stopped down, at least within reason to, like, say f8 or something like that, I think should also solve the spherical aberration focus shifts that you get in some lenses like the RF 100mm macro. That lens, because it's focusing wide open and then stopping down, you end up with a focus shift, at least for like, I think it's f4 to f8 or something, f4 to f5, 6, or between f4 and f8, something like that. It's noticeable. But if the camera is focusing at f5, 6, in theory, it should be able to not have, it'll focus where the accurate, or focus where the image indicates focus is, and that's going to be where the shifted focus is, not where it was when it focused wide open. One last thing, and this one is just something I'd like to see. So we have continued to increase the frame rates on our cameras. When the R5 and R6 came out, we had 20 frames per second burst mode. When the R6 or the R3 came out, that went up to 30 frames per second in continuous drive mode. When the R6 Mark II came out, Canon upped it to 40 frames per second in continuous drive mode. In theory, you could go right on up to whatever the camera can do for video, at least in theory. What this has done, at least for me, is that I find I won't shoot in the highest frame rates anymore. Like, I might want to use the electronic shutter, but because it's quiet, but because the frame rate is 20 frames a second and I only need 5, I'm not inclined to use it because I just waste frames. Now, yeah, it's not wasting frames like, well, I'm going to run out of film in 36 exposures or 30 exposures or whatever. I have to process it. I have to deal with it after the fact. So yeah, it fills up the card a little faster, but if you shoot video, you probably already have 256 gig or 1 terabyte cards anyway, because you kind of need it for the high resolution video. But the overhead ends up being that I have to download more pictures. I have to look at more pictures to find the ones that I want, and I have to delete more pictures in that whole cycle. So there's not just a storage burden or storage overhead or storage cost. There's a cognitive cost. I can't edit as quickly because I have to deal with more, essentially, noise. So that said, high continuous frame rates can absolutely be useful. Like, I'm not discounting them. Stuff even as I think is ridiculous as Nikon's 120 frame per second press ready JPEG mode on the Z9. Well, I think that's entirely ridiculous. I'm not discounting it as being not useful, but there is a cost to me as a photographer for these features. An example of where this, to me, becomes problematic. You're on safari in Africa or wherever, and let's just say it's Africa, and there is a leopard sitting in a tree, and you're set up on the leopard, and you know it's going to jump down from the tree, and you want to get it jumping down from the tree and landing. Well, I can't put my camera in single release because if I do, I can't change it to continuous high fast enough when the leopard jumps to get anything. I'm going to just totally miss everything. So I'm going to have to set the camera up to the fastest frame rate or burst rate that I can have it run at, which is going to be like continuous high, because that's what I need in the end for the action shot that I'm set up for. But along this time, the leopard's going to do interesting things in the tree. It's going to yawn. It's going to, blink. It's going to look at me. It's going to stick its tongue out at me. It's whatever. And I'm going to want to shoot those. Well, if I'm shooting at 40 frames a second on a R6 Mark II or 30 frames a second on an R3, every time I hit the shutter release, the odds are good I'm going to get somewhere between 8 and 10 frames. I didn't need 8 and 10 frames, but I'm going to get somewhere between 8 and 10 frames or something to that range. 6 to 10, 6 to 8 frames, something in that range. Now, it used to be on cameras with 10 frame per second motor drives that I could squeeze off a single frame, or maybe 2, at 10 frames a second. At 40 frames a second, that 2 frames becomes 8 or something like that. It's a much bigger number. And combine that with, if you're shooting with a camera like the R5, so okay, it's only 20 frames a second in this case, but it's a 45 megapixel image each time. So here's what I would like. Here's the idea. I'm calling it adaptive continuous shooting. And basically the way I imagine this working is the camera will shoot, essentially, this works better on a purely electronic shuttered cameras like, say, the Z9, will shoot essentially at its maximum burst rate. So let's just call it, in the case of, like, say, an R5, or let's just, in the case of, say, an R3, whatever, let's just say it's 30 frames a second. So the camera will shoot at 30 frames a second. It will then compare each subsequent image. And there's very fast image processing techniques to measure the difference between images. So if two images are exactly the same or very nearly the same, then you don't maybe need the second image. You can throw it away, you can not save it, or the third image, or the fourth image, or whatever. There'd have to be a boundary you'd have to set somewhere. But when images start changing significantly, so like as the leopard starts moving and you start moving the camera to track it, the differences in the images are going to change dramatically from frame to frame, as opposed to when the leopard's just sitting in the tree and not doing anything and the image doesn't change dramatically. And you use that as a cue to increase the frame rate. So in the way I'm envisioning this, you would set like a minimum frame rate, say maybe 10 frames a second, a maximum frame rate, say 30 frames a second, or whatever the max of the camera is. And when you got the leopard up in the tree, it's not moving, you could squeeze off 1 or 2 frames because the camera's going to look at the scene. Yeah, internally it's going to be shooting away at 30 frames a second, but it's going to be looking at the images and going, there's not a lot changing, just save 1/3 of the images, or whatever. So like 10 frames a second worth instead of 30 frames a second worth. And that means based on my reaction times, I can get 1 or 2 frames in that situation. As soon as things start moving, then the adaptive frame rate or adaptive continuous shooting sees these changes from frame to frame, and instead of disregarding the 2 and 3 and keeping 4 and disregarding 5 and 6, it starts keeping all of these additional frames because now things are firing up, things are getting spicy. You need to be able to get that peak action shot, and that's why you're shooting in 30 frames a second. So you lower the storage burden because when you still have to have the camera set at your max frame rate for whatever, but you lower the storage burden because when nothing changes and nothing's moving, you don't need to shoot 30 frames a second and get a ton of images that are all identical. But as soon as the images show motion, show change, it ramps up. Details, I'm not even going to speculate on, but that's the one feature that I would really like to see. I think it's something that's really necessary or needed now that we are starting to talk about, higher frame rates, much higher frame rates. Because I don't honestly, even if the R5 is a 60 megapixel camera, I have a hard time believing Canon won't have it shooting at 20 frames a second, if not more. Just on the grounds that there will be people who will be upset that you upped the resolution, but you took away my 20 frames a second. And that would be, I don't think they want to do that. I don't think that's a good trade-off. 20 frames a second, I think, is a good top-end frame rate. But trading 15 more megapixels for 10 frames a second or 15 frames a second is, I don't think, ideal. Of course, people will say, well, why didn't you add, more dynamic range or a fast rolling shutter or global electronic shutter? And that's all stuff I would like to see, but it's also stuff that I think everybody else is talking about when it comes to stuff. And I wanted to focus on some of the more kind of niche ideas that I have or have had for digital photography, for features that I think would be helpful to the photographer, but are maybe not being envisioned by photographers or by the camera companies to do them. So with that said, I'm going to wrap this podcast up here. I hope you found it interesting, at least. If you did, let me know by hitting that like button. If this kind of thing seems like it might be your kind of thing, please consider subscribing if you're not already. If you do like to support directly this channel and future content like this, please consider hitting that thanks button if you can. It's always appreciated. And as always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.